In the summer of 1211, the wind over the northern frontier carried more than dust. It carried the end of a dynasty's illusion of control, beyond the broken ridges of Yehuling. A series of harsh, wind-cut hills marking the borderlands between steppe and empire, two worlds faced one another in wary silence. To the south stood the vast, bureaucratic machine of the Jin Dynasty, heirs to a century of conquest and rule over northern China. To the north moved something far less predictable, the rising confederation forged by Genghis Khan. The confrontation was not sudden. It had been building for years. The Jin Dynasty, ruled by Jurchen elites, had once manipulated the tribes of the steppe with calculated diplomacy, elevating one clan to weaken another, supplying arms selectively, intervening just enough to prevent unity. It was a familiar frontier policy. Divide, reward, intimidate, maintain distance. But in 1206, that system collapsed. Temujin, now proclaimed Genghis Khan, unified the Mongol tribes under a single authority for the first time in generations. The tribes that had once raided each other now rode under a centralized command. Loyalty was reorganized. Units were decimalized. Discipline hardened. And most importantly, grievances were remembered. The Jin court underestimated what that unity meant. From Zhongdu, the imperial capital near modern Beijing, ministers read reports of steppe mobilization with an old framework in mind. They believed they were facing another confederation that would fracture under pressure. The steppe had always fractured, but this was different. Genghis Khan did not merely command loyalty through lineage. He commanded it through survival. His followers had endured starvation campaigns, betrayal, encirclement, and exile. Those who rode with him in 1211 were not loosely allied tribesmen. They were hardened survivors of internal Mongol wars, reorganized into disciplined tumans of 10,000. The Jin, by contrast, governed a sedentary empire of cities, agriculture, and layered administration. Their military system was vast but uneven. It included Jurchen cavalry elites, Chinese infantry conscripts, Khitan auxiliaries, and garrison forces stretched across fortified lines. On paper, the Jin possessed the advantage in numbers, equipment, and defensive infrastructure. But empires often mistake scale for cohesion. In early 1211, Genghis Khan made his decision. He would invade south. The choice was not reckless expansion. It was strategic compulsion. The Mongol Confederation required movement and plunder to sustain loyalty. A united steppe without external war risked internal fracture. Moreover, the Jin had recently insulted Mongol envoys and tightened trade restrictions, small acts that signaled continued contempt. War offered both wealth and legitimacy, but the geography mattered. Between Mongolia and the agricultural heartland of Jin territory stood a barrier zone, mountainous terrain reinforced by segments of fortified walls and guarded passes. Yehuling was not a single fortress, but a defensive belt. Control of its ridges meant access to the plains beyond. The Jin command understood this. They chose not to meet the Mongols deep in open territory, where cavalry maneuver would dominate. Instead, they would hold the high ground. They would use terrain to blunt mobility. They would force the nomads into constrained approaches. The strategy was rational. Yet, rational plans depend on assumptions. The Jin believed the Mongols would attack directly, testing fortified lines, exhausting themselves against repaired defenses. It was how previous steppe coalitions had behaved. Swift raids, not sustained campaigns. But Genghis Khan was not planning a raid. He was planning annihilation. Throughout the spring of 1211, Mongol forces advanced methodically toward the frontier. Scouts moved ahead in wide arcs, mapping water sources, measuring ridge gradients, tracking garrison strength. Communication between tumans remained constant. Signal systems allowed coordination across distances that sedentary commanders struggled to match. There was no haste. Speed would come later. Within the Jin court, debate intensified. Reports described the size of the approaching Mongol host with unsettling clarity. Tens of thousands of mounted archers, highly mobile, lightly supplied, unburdened by siege trains. Some ministers argue for a mobile counteroffensive. Meet the Mongols before they reach the passes. Others insisted on fortification defense. Let the walls absorb the assault. Ultimately, the Jin adopted a hybrid approach. A large field army would assemble near Yehuling, while fortified positions guarded key approaches. The objective was to block penetration at the mountain corridors. Command of this northern defense fell to experienced Jin generals, though internal rivalries lingered beneath formal unity. Coordination between Jurchen aristocratic cavalry and Chinese infantry divisions was uneven. Trust was procedural, not instinctive. Meanwhile, Mongol preparations continued with quiet precision. Genghis Khan divided his forces into multiple columns, avoiding a single predictable thrust. Some units probed secondary passes. Others advanced toward apparent weak points, deliberately revealing themselves to draw Jin attention. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout Mongol campaigns. Fragmentation to induce confusion, concentration at the decisive moment. As summer deepened, tension settled across the frontier hills. Jin soldiers fortified ridge lines, constructing defensive works among rocky outcroppings. Supply trains creaked northward. Messengers rode between command posts, carrying sealed orders and revised assessments. The empire was mobilizing with seriousness. But seriousness is not the same as adaptability. Across the highlands, Mongol scouts observed everything. They noted where Jin forces concentrated. They tracked response times to feigned movements. They identified which commanders reacted aggressively and which hesitated. The steppe army was learning its opponent. For the Mongols, war was not a clash of honor or ritual display. It was a system of pressure. Probe, provoke, isolate, encircle. By late summer, both armies were in proximity. Dust clouds marked their positions by day. Signal fires flickered by night. Neither side had yet committed fully. Yet beneath the apparent stalemate, psychological asymmetry had already begun. The Jin army, though numerically formidable, was static. It waited for the attack it expected. The Mongol army was dynamic. It shaped the battlefield before the battle began. Genghis Khan understood something fundamental about mountain warfare. Holding the heights does not guarantee control if your enemy dictates movement. A fortified ridge is powerful only if the attacker obliges by striking head-on. He had no intention of obliging. Instead, he would stretch the Jin line. He would force their commanders to redeploy repeatedly across uneven terrain, exhausting coordination. He would create the impression of weakness at one sector, only to appear elsewhere with overwhelming concentration. The passes of Yehuling were not merely physical obstacles. They were cognitive traps. As autumn approached, weather patterns began to shift. Cold winds returned early that year, sweeping through the hills with abrasive force. For infantry positioned on exposed slopes, endurance would become as critical as discipline. Mongol cavalry, accustomed to steppe winters, felt less strain. The imbalance was subtle but cumulative. By the time the first major engagements began, the Jin army would already be operating under reactive pressure, repositioning, recalculating, anticipating feints that might not come. The Mongols would choose the moment, and when that moment arrived, the defensive strategy of the Jin, logical, structured, and seemingly secure, would begin to unravel from within. The Battle of Yehuling was not decided in a single charge. It began with decisions made weeks earlier. Decisions about terrain, about mobility, about whether an empire built on walls could adapt to an enemy that refused to be fixed in place. As the frontier tightened and the distance between the two armies shrank to a matter of miles, the Jin commanders believed they were prepared. They did not yet understand that they were already being maneuvered. By early autumn of 1211, the two armies were no longer distant forces maneuvering across rumor and reconnaissance. They were within striking distance, separated by ridgelines and narrow corridors of stone and wind. The Jin field army assembled near Yehuling was formidable in appearance and scale. Contemporary accounts and later reconstructions suggest that the Jin command had gathered well over 100,000 troops to secure the frontier approaches. These forces were a composite structure typical of the dynasty's military organization, Jurchen heavy cavalry forming the elite shock arm, large bodies of Chinese infantry tasked with holding fortified positions and anchoring defensive lines, auxiliary units including chiton and other steppe origin troops familiar with mounted warfare, and logistical elements required to sustain such a mass in mountainous terrain. Their armor was heavier than that of their adversaries. Lamellar cuirasses, reinforced helmets, and shields provided resilience in close combat. They carried crossbows capable of formidable penetrative power. On open plains, with controlled formations and coordinated volleys, such a force could deliver punishing resistance. Yet the terrain of Yehuling did not favor the kind of rigid cohesion upon which Jin tactical doctrine depended. The hills were irregular, broken by ravines and shifting elevations that fragmented visibility. Communication between units relied on messengers traversing uneven slopes, sometimes under arrow fire. Signal coordination was slower than anticipated. The Jin generals, aware of these vulnerabilities, attempted to position their forces in layered depth. The forward elements occupied ridges and choke points, while reserves stood ready behind them to reinforce sectors under pressure. Their intention was to absorb Mongol advances and then counterattack downhill with concentrated cavalry force. The strategy was sound in theory. Compress the enemy into narrow corridors, deny maneuver, and overwhelm with weight. Opposing them, the Mongol army was smaller but operationally unified. Estimates placed Genghis Khan's invasion force at perhaps 80,000 to 90,000 mounted warriors, though exact numbers remain debated. What is less disputed is the internal organization. Each Tumen functioned as a self-contained unit with defined command hierarchy. Loyalty flowed upward through carefully structured decimal organization. Every warrior was both archer and rider, trained to fire accurately at speed and to maintain formation across shifting terrain. They carried composite bows of layered horn and sinew capable of exceptional range and penetration, even against armored opponents when volleys were coordinated. Their armor was lighter, prioritizing endurance and speed over static protection. Crucially, they required minimal supply chains compared to Jin. Each rider maintained multiple horses, allowing rotation during long movements. They could disperse, forage, and reconcentrate with fluidity unfamiliar to their sedentary adversaries. Genghis Khan did not immediately order a full assault. Instead, he intensified pressure through calculated probes. Small detachments advanced toward visible Jin positions, skirmishing at the edges of crossbow range before retreating deliberately. These engagements were not attempts to break the line, but to measure response times and test discipline. Jin commanders, wary of being drawn out, held their ground at first, yet each feint required assessment. Each Mongol withdrawal created uncertainty. Was it a genuine retreat or an invitation to pursue? The psychological strain began to accumulate. Units rotated between alert and action without decisive engagement. Supplies had to be redistributed along elongated defensive arcs as Mongol columns appeared unexpectedly at secondary approaches. One of the defining characteristics of Mongol warfare was the orchestration of multiple simultaneous movements. While one wing applied visible pressure against a fortified ridge, another maneuvered through less obvious passes, sometimes traversing difficult ground that Jin commanders believed impractical for large formations. Mongol riders were accustomed to navigating harsh landscapes. Steep inclines and narrow tracks did not deter them in a way Jin planners had anticipated. This flexibility allowed Genghis Khan to stretch the defensive perimeter. The Jin army, committed to holding a broad frontage, was forced into repeated redeployments. Each redeployment required coordination between infantry anchoring positions and cavalry units tasked with reinforcement. In mountainous terrain, such coordination was slow and fatiguing. As days passed, skirmishes intensified. Arrows darkened narrow valleys. Jin crossbow units attempted to establish kill zones along predictable Mongol approaches, but the Mongols rarely obliged by entering them directly. Instead, they fired from oblique angles, exploiting elevation shifts and then withdrawing before sustained counterfire could fix their position. Dust clouds rose and dispersed unpredictably in mountain wind, complicating visual identification of force size. A small Mongol detachment could appear larger through rapid movement across ridges, creating the illusion of mass where none existed. Conversely, larger Mongol concentrations concealed themselves behind terrain folds until a decisive moment. The first major engagement unfolded when Jin commanders, interpreting a Mongol withdrawal as overextension, committed a significant cavalry force downhill to pursue. This decision followed days of harassment. The Jin cavalry, heavily armored and disciplined, advanced in structured formation. Initially, The move appeared justified. Mongol units fell back in apparent disorder, abandoning ground they had contested earlier. The pursuit accelerated, yet as the Jin cavalry descended further from their infantry support, cohesion began to strain. The broken terrain disrupted tight formation. Communication between sub-commanders became difficult. It was at this moment that the Mongol tactic, refined through years of steppe warfare, revealed its intent. The retreat had been controlled. Mongol riders turned in coordinated arcs, releasing volleys while maintaining distance. They did not seek immediate collision. Instead, they extended pursuit laterally, drawing Jin cavalry into a widening arc away from their defensive base. Additional Mongol detachments, previously concealed, emerged on the flanks. What had begun as a downhill charge transformed into a multi-directional engagement. Jin cavalry now faced arrow fire from shifting angles. Their heavier armor provided protection against isolated hits, but sustained volleys eroded formation integrity. Horses, less protected than riders, became targets. As mounts fell, gaps opened. Command signals struggled to penetrate the chaos of movement and dust. Simultaneously, other Mongol columns intensified pressure against different sectors of the Jin line. The defenders could not easily determine whether the cavalry engagement was the main assault or another diversion. Reserves hesitated. To commit fully risked exposing other approaches. To withhold support risked encirclement of the pursuing force. In this hesitation lay the essence of Mongol operational design. Induced decision paralysis through simultaneous threats. Over successive days, similar patterns repeated. Feigned retreats lured localized counterattacks. Concentrated arrow storms weakened isolated units. Rapid redeployment allowed Mongols to appear where Jin commanders believed them absent. The psychological toll on Jin soldiers deepened. They were trained for set-piece confrontation, for the solidity of shield walls and coordinated cavalry thrusts. Instead, they faced an adversary who refused stability. Sleep was fragmented by constant alarms. The cold winds of the highlands intensified fatigue. Supply lines, stretched across defensive ridges, struggled to maintain consistent distribution under persistent harassment. Genghis Khan maintained centralized strategic direction while delegating tactical flexibility to trusted lieutenants. Communication between Mongol units, facilitated by disciplined signaling and prearranged contingency planning, allowed swift concentration at chosen points. Unlike the Jin, whose chain of command layered aristocratic authority over diverse ethnic units, the Mongol command structure emphasized merit and loyalty forged in prior campaigns. Orders translated into action with minimal friction. Eventually, the Jin defensive perimeter thinned in critical sectors. What had begun as a broad fortified line evolved into a series of stressed nodes attempting to cover too much ground. Mongol forces identified a vulnerable corridor between two Jin groupings where terrain complexity hindered mutual support. Under cover of sustained skirmishing elsewhere, a substantial Mongol contingent advanced through this gap with calculated speed. Their objective was not merely to break through, but to penetrate deeply enough to threaten the cohesion of the entire defensive arrangement. When the Jin command recognized the scale of this movement, they faced a deteriorating situation. Reinforcing the threatened corridor required withdrawing troops from adjacent ridges, weakening those positions. Yet failure to respond risked allowing Mongol forces to cut communication lines behind the main army. The decision to redeploy came under pressure and incomplete information. By the time adjustments were executed, Mongol riders had already begun to exploit the opening, striking at supply elements and rear positions. The battle at Yehuling was no longer a contained frontier defense. It was becoming a contest of mobility within constrained space, and the side better adapted to fluid warfare was gaining initiative. What remained uncertain was whether the Jin command could restore coherence before localized setbacks cascaded into systemic collapse. The next phase would determine whether their numerical strength could be reorganized into decisive resistance, or whether the Mongol method, pressure, fragmentation, encirclement, would complete its design. The turning point at Yehuling did not arrive with a thunderous clash, but through a gradual, almost imperceptible unraveling of command and confidence. Days of Mongol harassment had already strained the Jin formations. Their soldiers were fatigued, their reserves scattered across ridges, and their commanders faced relentless uncertainty. The Mongols had avoided a frontal commitment until this precise moment, carefully observing where hesitation, miscommunication, and exhaustion intersected. The critical breakthrough occurred when a concentrated Mongol detachment exploited a narrow, inadequately reinforced pass in the northern sector of the Jin line. For the Jin, it was a culmination of accumulated pressures. The pursuit of feigned retreats had thinned their forward positions, coordination between units had faltered under terrain and fatigue, and the psychological weight of constant, unpredictable attacks had begun to erode judgment. The moment was fleeting, but its consequences were immediate. Mongol horse archers, moving with astonishing speed and cohesion, descended into the valley, unleashing coordinated volleys that targeted both horses and riders. The heavy Jin cavalry, designed to shock and overwhelm in structured engagements, could not pivot effectively in the uneven terrain, and their armor, so advantageous in controlled confrontations, became a liability against sustained, mobile harassment. The initial impact did not annihilate them, but it fragmented their cohesion and exposed vulnerabilities in the broader defensive network. The Jin generals, recognizing the severity of the penetration, attempted to counterattack. Infantry units were ordered to shift along ridges to support the embattled sector, and reserves were deployed to seal the breach. Yet the mountainous environment slowed every movement, and the Mongols, masters of terrain exploitation, had anticipated these responses. They maneuvered around obstacles with speed and precision, appearing unpredictably on the flanks of repositioning forces. The Jin command faced an impossible calculus: reinforce one threatened area and risk weakening another, or hold positions and allow the enemy to dictate action. In the confusion, misinterpretations of signals and conflicting orders began to multiply. Units engaged in local defense without awareness of neighboring contingents' movements, creating gaps that Mongol detachments exploited to deepen the breach. The psychological strain on the soldiers intensified. Heavy armor made sustained movement exhausting, and the cold winds of early autumn cut through even-layered clothing. Exhaustion and fear spread contagiously, eroding the disciplined rigidity that had previously distinguished the Jin army. As the day progressed, the Mongols began to apply encirclement tactics that were subtle yet devastating. Detachments that had engaged the Jin front lines gradually widened their arcs, cutting off retreating soldiers and threatening supply lines. Lightly armored and highly mobile, Mongol horse archers could disengage at will, reappear in a new sector, and maintain constant pressure without overextending. Jin units that attempted to hold static defensive positions found themselves increasingly isolated. Attempts at coordinated counterattacks were hampered by delayed communications and the difficulty of relaying orders across fractured terrain. The Mongols' mastery of speed and deception created a cascading effect. The more the Jin tried to respond, the more they revealed new vulnerabilities. Soldiers confronted with sudden flanking attacks or unexpected volleys lost situational awareness. Panic, even if restrained by discipline, began to ripple through the ranks. Small pockets of retreat were amplified by neighboring units, turning localized withdrawals into broader disorder. By the second day of the decisive engagements, the Jin line had lost its integrity. Previously contiguous formations had become segmented, with forward attachments cut off from reserves. Mongol detachments pressed relentlessly, concentrating forces at points of weakness while feigning activity elsewhere. This forced Jin commanders into reactionary measures, moving units repeatedly to respond to threats, constantly recalculating under incomplete information. Each redeployment exhausted men and horses further. Those in the rear, once confident of support from neighboring ridges, now found themselves engaged directly by Mongol forces. Commanders attempted to restore order, but the geography amplified delays in communication, and even experienced subordinates struggled to interpret rapidly shifting conditions. The psychological pressure compounded tactical vulnerability. Soldiers who had been drilled for structured engagement now faced an enemy that refused to be pinned down. Fatigue, fear, and confusion eroded both morale and effectiveness. The collapse accelerated when Mongol forces concentrated on a central sector of the Jin position, the hinge upon which much of the defensive network rested. By applying pressure simultaneously from the front, flanks, and high ground, they created perception that the entire army was at risk of encirclement. Jin units attempted to counter by massing reserves into the threatened sector, but the terrain slowed movement, and Mongol riders exploited gaps to harass and fracture advancing forces. Heavy cavalry charges, once decisive, became hazardous in constricted passes, and infantry units could not provide sufficient protection in time. The Mongols did not merely attack. They choreographed the battlefield to generate self-inflicted errors among their opponents. As units were drawn out of position or overextended, Mongols feigned retreats and returned in sudden, concentrated strikes. The combination of physical pressure and psychological manipulation magnified the apparent size and unpredictability of the attacking force. By midday, disorder became pronounced. Forward Jin units were surrounded in small pockets, forced to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. Supply lines and messengers could no longer traverse ridges safely. The chain of command strained under conflicting priorities. Maintain control of critical terrain, rescue isolated units, and counterattack at multiple points. Decisions were made with incomplete or inaccurate information, often leading to further entanglement. Cavalry units attempting to disengage from compromised positions collided with infantry, creating bottlenecks that Mongols exploited with arrow volleys and rapid encirclement. Panic began to spread in earnest. Soldiers abandoned positions to preserve their lives. Units fragmented and morale plummeted. What had begun as a controlled defensive engagement transformed into chaotic retreat. The Mongols, meanwhile, maintained cohesion. Commanders reinforced successful sectors, withdrew from overextended positions, and redirected forces to exploit newly opened avenues. The mobility advantage allowed them to concentrate firepower and shock at precise points without overcommitting. Each maneuver reinforced the psychological dominance of the Mongol army. The Jin soldiers increasingly perceived the attackers as omnipresent, striking unpredictably from multiple angles. By late afternoon, the Jin front had disintegrated in critical areas. Attempts at orderly withdrawal were undermined by persistent harassment and the uneven terrain that favored mounted archers. Horses exhausted, infantry demoralized, and commanders unable to exert centralized control, the retreat devolved into flight. As the Jin army fled, the Mongols did not merely pursue blindly. Small, disciplined detachments cut off likely escape routes, harassed rear units, and captured key positions. The focus was on sustaining pressure to prevent regrouping, rather than on annihilation alone. Those who fell behind were quickly overtaken or forced to surrender. Historical accounts suggest that large segments of the Jin forces disintegrated, with thousands of casualties and thousands more captured.